I will just. So officially, hello everybody, online and in person. This is the fourth series right now of these transdisciplinary conversations. It's an idea that I have a while ago to trying to bring people from like many different fields of expertise that work here at Caltech to talk about many topics that we have in common. We are all people in this case, and we all have brains, and I guess we all have consciousness and free will, but that's maybe something we want to debate today. And we are very privileged to have here the presence of Mudrik. Is that
Liad?
Yeah. Liad, okay. So she's a professor in Tel Aviv, but she's here for 1 year as a sabbatical. She works in the topics of consciousness and free will, but also she has a double degree in cognitive neuroscience and philosophy. So it's a very, very high privilege to have her here with this expertise. Besides that,
you just need to press start.
Yes, I will. Give me a second. Yeah. So as we have done it in the past, we have set up a few questions from you guys or that I have prepared to lead the conversation, but this is very open. The idea is to be very relaxed. If somebody has a question that leads up to another question, please feel free to speak. I tend to speak the most because I'm leading the conversation, but please take the lead if you want to. Does anybody has like a previous question before we go to these, the ones that are here in the slide? No, somebody online? Okay, I think not. Okay, so.
I have one.
Oh, yes, please. And if you want, look, this is a microphone. Oh, okay. So the people online will hear you better if you go, you either move it there.
Yeah, it's just like a simple question of, I don't know if you know the difference between consciousness and experience, because it seems to me like my cat has an experience, right? It's like crawling around, it wants things, cannot think like me. But what's it? Yeah, I have a hard time differentiating between consciousness and experience. Like what's the yeah?
Thank you for the question. So David, right? I would say, first of all, I would start and say that consciousness is probably one of the topics or one of the terms for which the definition has been repeatedly discussed and argued about, and so on and so forth. So it's not as if I can give you now the dictionary definition of consciousness. I can. There is a definition in the dictionary for consciousness, but different theories and different thinkers have different definitions for consciousness. My definition of consciousness is actually experience. So, and I think that the field at large accepts this, that when we speak about consciousness, we speak about the ability to experience events in the world or internal events in a way that is qualitative. So it feels like something to have that experience. The taste of chocolate, the redness of bread, blah, blah. Now, when you refer to your cat, first of all, I would say there is an ongoing discussion about which animals other than humans are conscious. If I had to guess, and we don't have currently a good enough test for consciousness. There are different tests, again, there are different views. If I had to guess, I would say that your cat is probably conscious in the sense that it does experience events in the world, also potentially internal events. I agree that it doesn't think the way you think, but this to me is already another layer, which is cognition. Now, you can have a conscious experience of a cognitive event. When you think, then you can either, if you do that with your inner voice or whatever other way, you can have a conscious experience of thinking that thought. But this on its own, I don't think thinking per se is not conscious to me. It's another layer, and then you can either think consciously or think unconsciously. Here too, you can debate whether there could be unconscious thoughts, but for me, consciousness is experience. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking.
That is a really cool picture of like a layer, like I can think about my thoughts, and I don't think I don't know if my cat can think about his own thoughts. He can really react and think, oh, food over there, but it doesn't say it.
Right.
It feels like excitement of food. but yeah, it probably doesn't think, oh,
Yeah, I am now aware of having a thought.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's a question of whether cats have thoughts and how do we define thoughts. That's a completely different discussion. But with respect to consciousness, for me, as I said, it's the ability to have access to an experience that is qualitatively, that has a qualitative aspect.
But I mean, for example, I have seen videos of cats or other animals that they can recognize themselves in the mirror. Does your definition of consciousness also include the self-awareness, that the fact that you are an entity having experiences, or it can be without that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about cats. I know that definitely chimpanzees, orangutan can recognize themselves in the mirror. There has been, I remember a paper in Current Biology about, if I'm not mistaken, about macaque monkeys, but there was discussion whether this is trained or not trained and so on. So self-awareness is again a different layer as far as I'm concerned. So you could be conscious, I think, without having self-awareness in the sense of recognizing yourself as the subject of your own actions. Right? But there are many theories. So you can think about Olaf Blanke's work, for example, who was interested in self-consciousness, that postulate that every experience assumes in some way self-awareness, but not self-awareness in the sense that being aware of myself as a subject, but being constrained to my own perspective, and acknowledging and being, so this kind of bodily awareness as maybe the most primary form of awareness one has. So there are two different meanings of self-awareness as well. Mm-hmm. It's complicated. So.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you can have the opposite, being self-aware but not being conscious, I guess.
Being self-aware but not being conscious. So again, it depends on how you define self-aware. Mm-hmm. So if you define self-aware as being able to perceive yourself as the cause of your action, I can think of a robot that would be able to differentiate between its own actions and someone else's actions, but not have any qualitative aspect to their experiences. And that could be a form of self-awareness without consciousness, the way I define it. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
I have a small follow-up question. So, like for me, this definition of consciousness as experience could be a little problematic when you think of defining the unconscious, because maybe like when we're asleep or something like that, or what people usually call unconscious, also involves experiences that we absorb, like or assimilate, like qualitatively.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So I think that when I process information unconsciously, what's missing is the qualitative aspect of it, in the sense that I don't have, so let's say that I am presented with a red square, a cliche example. So I'm being presented with a red square unconsciously. And you ask me, what did you see? I say nothing. How did it feel like? It felt like nothing because I didn't see it. But when you present the stimulus in a stronger manner, and I have a conscious experience of it, I can tell you, yes, I've seen it, and it's red, and it feels like warmth or whatever you associate with red. So that's the key difference. Your brain processes the information in both cases. It could even affect your behavior to some degree, although you haven't seen it. But what you're missing is exactly that experience.
Awareness.
Exactly, the access to the fact that you have just experienced something, and the qualitative aspect of how this something felt like. That's the difference.
Can you maybe define what kind of distinguish between experience, how you think of what experience constitutes versus what awareness constitutes? Because I guess we're using these words, but I'm not sure exactly what everybody means by experience or by awareness.
So I use consciousness, awareness, and experience interchangeably. So whenever I have an experience, meaning that it's conscious, that I have access to that experience, it feels like something. Then for me, that's the meaning of having an experience.
But what do you mean when you say it feels like something?
Okay, so let me give that example. So I like chocolates, so many of my examples are based on chocolate. So let's say that I was a robot and I put a piece of chocolate in my mouth. The taste buds on some, not even before the robot. So when I put a piece of chocolate in my mouth, the taste buds on my own tongue process information about this piece of chocolate, about the amount of glucose it has on and so forth. And that entrains like a cascade of events that at the end of the day lead to me eating the chocolate again and again and again. And that's one thing that happens. We process the information and it affects our behavior. But if you're not a machine, then, or at least if you're human, and probably also other animals, then this process is also involved with the taste of chocolate. You have an experience of what the chocolate feels like, what it tastes like. If you're a computer, now if you're presented with a red square, you could say, this is a red square. You can identify its squareness and its redness. But you don't, as far as we know about computers today, you will not be able to tell me what it feels like to see a red square as opposed to a blue square or a green circle. So for humans and presumably other animals as well, when we process information, at least in some conditions, because we could also process information unconsciously, but when we process information consciously, it's always accompanied by something it feels like to have that experience. The taste of chocolate, the blueness of the sky, the pitch, the specific pitch of what the sound that you hear, they all feel like something. There is a qualitative aspect to it. There is a very famous paper by Thomas Nagel, you might know it, What It Is Like to Be a Bat from 1974, where he tries to give an example of what this subjective experience is, relying on the difference between our sensory system and that of a bat. So a bat could could map the visual environment very well, including processing the texture, the size, the shape, and so on, doing that mostly based on echolocation as opposed to vision, right? And so Nagel asks what it is like to be a bat. How does it feel like? And what he tried to claim there is that we could never understand that. We don't have access to the subjective experience of that bat. Let's say that we map all the neurons in that bat's brain. It still doesn't give us the conscious experience itself. Let's say we imagine that instead of eyes, we have this sonar system. Now you're probably all imagining this green thing that is like detecting submarines and so on and so forth. Or you can imagine being all day upside down and sleeping during the day and being awake during the night. But that won't be having access to what it is like to be a bat. It would be having access to what Liad would feel like if she would behave like a bat. So this qualitative aspect of experience, which according to Nagel is inaccessible to us. So he claims that there is a knowledge gap between what we can know and what we cannot know, in this case, what it is like to be a bat. And that is the qualitative aspect of experience that I'm talking about. I hope that it clarifies this.
Well, I mean,
sorry, just one. You cannot be heard too much in the microphone, so I put the microphone there, or she can rephrase what you said, just for the people online.
Yeah. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question is, from the description, it feels like this would not be accessible to anybody but that. So then, is there any way for anybody to know what it feels like to be anything other than themselves?
That's the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. So if you want to read so this in a way is an early formulation of the hard problem of consciousness presented by David Palmer in 1995, which is why some brain areas are accompanied with a conscious experience, while some brain processes are accompanied by a conscious experience, and some are not. And what you're referring to is the problem of other minds. Like, can I know what it is like to be you? You know, some people, there is this famous gene. Now, I might not be getting the details accurately, so please, if anyone knows differently, correct me. But for when people eat cilantro, depending on their genotype, it feels different. It tastes different. So for some people, it literally tastes like, I don't know, soap or something. Mm-hmm. And for others, it tastes like cilantro, like the thing I like to eat. So I don't know. I love cilantro. And I don't know what it feels like for that person with that gene to eat cilantro. More than that, I don't know what it's like for you to eat chocolate. Now, some philosophers say this shows that science will never be able to fully explain consciousness. Others say no. Some say we might be able to, when we have all the knowledge, all the physical knowledge, we actually will be able to know exactly what it feels like to have any experience, if we have enough computational powers and so on and so on. Others say you are now mystifying an issue that is actually not mysterious at all. When you talk about this knowledge gap and this inability to know what something is like for someone else, you're overcomplicating a very simple problem. Not simple, but something that is utterly physical and can be fully explained. And given so, then it gives this nice example of can I experience sonata by Bach the same way that someone from Leipzig in the 16th century has? Well, he says, yes, if you simulate all the conditions that they had, so your brain is exposed to the same prayers that they were exposed to, and so on and so forth, and like your cultural exposure would be the same, and if you knew everything that there is to know about their brain system, you could feel exactly the way they do. Now you could again debate and discuss over that. I think that I don't have an answer to the question about the knowledge gap. Like, or the epistemological gap, can we close it or not? I think that we can make substantial progress towards understanding the relations between neural activity and consciousness, even if this gap at the end will remain open. So even if at the end of the day, I will never know how your chocolate tastes and how it is for me to eat, as compared to what it is like for me to eat chocolate, if I am able to understand how your brain gives rise to your consciousness and how it gives rise to my consciousness, that for me is more than enough.
Anyone online would like to contribute something? I hope they hear me. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say something. Okay. Oh, the laptop microphone.
What microphone?
Okay. How does it work now? Much better? I think I have all the time the microphone in my laptop instead of this one. Okay, is it better now? But it was okay. Okay. Yeah, but I think now should be better. Is it better?
Can you hear us better as well, or only?
Yes, it says it's better.
Okay. Okay.
But I guess there are no questions through the online people. Yes.
I have one. So this cilantro example made me think a little bit of when people got COVID and then they started like smelling things differently, and so I'm wondering if consciousness is indeed like strictly linked to physical phenomena, like your brain was inflamed during a while and then you just experienced another conscious state, or is it something that exceeds like the physical?
So this is a matter of ontological stand. So I don't think that this is a matter that would be determined empirically. But if you ask me where I stand, I think that consciousness is fully physical. I don't think that there is anything beyond the physical, and like everything in our experience is fully determined by the brain. And every experience we have is the result of the combination between the physical properties of the stimulus that we are experiencing and the physical properties of our nervous system, which in turn is a result of our genetics, plus all the experiences we had throughout our lives that shaped each and every one of us nervous system to get it to the way it is in a specific moment. And so I think that, COVID, and you have many other examples. Yes, your experiences changes. Even, think about when you wake up with a blocked nose. Food tastes differently. That's a very simple example, right? Visual illusions. So we don't experience the world as it is. We experience the world as it is being. I think the way I think about it is that we experience the best model or the best guess our brain can generate about the external reality.
So could we try to simulate other types of consciousness? Like, given that we know that COVID did this, and can we create these?
So there are studies. So for example, Nancy Kanwisher simulated neurons in that respond to faces in FFA, and all of the sudden, and like there was a basketball in front of the patient, and all of a sudden the patient saw a face on the basketball. So there is a clear physical manipulation that caused a difference in your conscious experience. Can we give rise to different types of consciousness? I think that's what people do with psychedelics, right? So definitely we can do things, and even think about there is a very nice and compelling illusion called the Mudrik effect. I don't know if you are familiar with it in psychology. Look for it online, like in YouTube. You see a guy and you hear the sound ba ba ba, but then the guy starts, the lips utter the sound va va or da da, and all of a sudden this is what you hear. So what you see determines the conscious experience of what you hear, because we are now, the best guess about what that person is saying is no longer ba ba, although this is the exact stimulus that is being presented. The best guess is determined by the way the lips move, and that's how you can manipulate your own consciousness like that.
It seems to me that the whole reason around your consciousness is informed by the tools I have at my disposal to sense the world, right? Like, so there's nothing objective about like the world, about what I see. Like what I see as a construction of my brain, given this thing. And if like evolution had taken a different path, and you have like ears, like or a different, I would have a way different experience, but still, but consciousness or experience would still be there, no?
Yes. Think about just to interrupt for a second. Think about color vision. Yeah. Right. So the number of photoreceptors that you have determine what you're going to see, and that's exactly evolution changing your consciousness. And there is an interesting experiment where they actually implanted an additional photoreceptor and then expanded the range of I think I don't remember, I think it was like genetic manipulation, and then the animals saw more colors. So that's and where do you draw the line between things that can sense and experience? I mean, like the cat, sure, a worm, maybe a bacterium. That's one of the $1 million questions. Yeah. So where do you draw the line between a cockroach, for example, an ant, a bee, a cat? And one of the things that I've been thinking about more and more recently is this entire concept of a test for consciousness, and how we can use existing theories of consciousness in order to develop tests that would allow us to answer these questions, not only for animals, but for AI, for fetuses. Like, these are highly important questions that have extremely significant ethical implications. But unfortunately, there are several tests today, but none of them is such that there is a consensus on, and I cannot give you an answer about where within the evolutionary tree, so to speak, consciousness emerges.
And what are the proposals for these tests? Kind of what are some?
Yeah, so there are different approaches. So some say, let's try to, okay, let's start maybe from humans and then go beyond. So a very famous work by Adrian Owen, I think it was 94, published in Science, was conducted on patients that were held to be in an unresponsive state. And they put them in the magnet and they told them, now imagine that you're playing tennis or imagine that you're navigating in your house. And we know from healthy controls that when you imagine that you're playing tennis, you have activity in the primary motor area. And when you're navigating, you will have an experience in the hippocampus. So then some of the patients that he scanned showed brain activity that was very similar to controls, suggesting that they can hear the instruction, they can imagine it, and they generate the same or very similar brain activity. And they even went on in order to use this as means to communicate with them and ask questions, and the patient replied. So this is, it's a cognitive, in a way, it's a test that rides on a cognitive ability to fill out instructions or follow instructions, because we know from healthy participants that this is not something that you can do unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, the unconscious control is where the person is anesthetized and then put in the magnet and the same thing.
Or there are many, yes, so just to repeat, if people didn't hear, so people during anesthesia won't show that. And also many of the patients who were scanned didn't show this activation. But some of them did, suggesting that they were in fact conscious of their surroundings.
And did they report post the experiments? Did they have memory of the experience? Or not?
So these are people in what we used to call vegetative state or minimally conscious. So they cannot report or wake up. But that was like a huge discovery that some of them are actually conscious of their surroundings as opposed to what people have thought. And then, so this is one type of test. Another type of test relies on the complexity of neural activity. So this is Marcello Massimini, and this is based on a theory called integrated information theory. Maybe Christoph, I imagine, spoke about it here as well. So, and then they have a very strong measure that can predict who would wake up later on and who would not. There are even way simpler tests. There is one developed by Anat Arzi where they just rely on a sniffing response. So when this was published in Nature 2020 or something, 21. So when we are presented with a very strong aversive smell, we have this sniffing response. And this turned out to be a very strong predictor for which patients are going to recover from, I don't know if it was coma or vegetative state. Today they don't use vegetative state anymore. They say unresponsive syndrome, unresponsiveness syndrome. So this is one sort of test applied to people in a clinical setting with disorders of consciousness. You could also apply to people who are asleep during non-REM sleep and so on and so forth. There are other tests that are aimed at asking, okay, what about other species? You could also apply some of these to other species. There are tests that are based on behavioral measures. So if you think, for example, that trace conditioning or associative learning or the ability to detect global deviations is something that requires consciousness, then you could use that as a measure to determine which system is conscious and which is not. I'll give an example. So the detection of global deviance, this is based on the global neuronal workspace theory. And the idea, excuse me, I'm gonna give you a demonstration. It's not very, there's some embarrassment into it, but we'll survive. So if you present like a sequence of beeps and say beep, 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 beep. So the last sequence, the last sound did not deviate from locally but it did deviate globally because you already learned to expect that the last time sound would be a deviation. Now, what people have shown from Stan DeHaan's group is that without consciousness, you can detect the local deviance, but not the global one. So this could then constitute a test for consciousness, which you could also apply on animals. So check your cat, you know. Now, this is of course based on the assumption that what in humans is a cognitive process that depends on consciousness, also depends on consciousness in other systems, right? So I can think of an AI that could easily pick up on the global deviance, and I'm not sure I would want to claim that it is conscious. So there are questions here, right? But there are different tests and different approaches, and I find it intriguing and try to think about it more and more these days. And I don't know, let's see where it takes me. But,
I actually think what you just said about this experiment to say global versus the local, it's the reason why we can appreciate music or arts. Because it's a combination of something expected that sets up the baseline plus something unexpected that makes us get interest. So I can also imagine that like conscious beings like that are able to appreciate music like something that you can differentiate from non-being conscious in a certain way.
But then the question becomes what constitutes appreciation, because not everybody appreciates all music.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like, oh my God, I like music, you don't, you are not conscious.
Yeah.
But they know it's something that is meant for themselves to appreciate, as she said, appreciate the global versus only the local. You know?
Right. Yeah.
Also like Bayesian inference, like right, because like I kind of, I don't know, like to give me a paper on, I don't know, like finance, I won't know, I won't appreciate like you can find it beautiful. Now it's like, oh, this is really cool, but I don't know. But if I know a lot about something, if I have like strong back, I can see more. Does it have to?
Yeah, and there's a big question about how your knowledge shapes your experience.
Yeah.
This is something that we study in the lab quite a lot. So how semantics and knowledge can affect the way you process information at the perceptual stages and even the way you perceive the world.
There was a question in the chat. I was trying to read it. Regarding the point of view that consciousness is fully experienced by the brain, how can we then explain how our thoughts can alter the brain activity? For example, neuroimaging or the experience of pain that can be modified by mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah, so this is an excellent example, in my opinion, for one brain process to modulate another brain process. So for me, mindfulness is an example of when you enter into a specific practice, and then this affects your brain activity, definitely. But I don't think that the mindfulness was not physical as well. So I cannot think of any process that we perform that does not originate from the brain. But again, I just want to emphasize, so this was actually in my PhD in philosophy, one of the chapters was about this point exactly. So I can present you with very compelling data, I think, that when I perturb the brain in some way, I can change your experience, I can change your mood. So Professor Yitzhak Fried, who is a neurosurgeon working in UCLA and originally an Israeli one, so he had a patient where he had an electrode, I believe it was the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And whenever he stimulated the electrode, the patient started laughing. And so he was reading a story, or even, I don't know, maybe even the phone book. And then she was, bursting and laughing. And he says, not him, but like the experimenter says, what's funny? And I don't know, maybe it was him. And she says, the way you're reading it, it's super funny. And then he stops the simulation and it's not funny anymore. So if you're a physicalist like me, thinking that everything, all phenomena in the world are physical, but let me just put a small disclaimer, I'll get to that in a second.
That's the first question.
Yeah. So if that's what you think, then say, hey, this is a great example of physicalism. But if you're a dualist and specifically one that believes in parallelism, so thinking that there are two causal chains, one in the physical world and one in the mental world, and there is perfect harmony between them, then the finding that I just quoted to you doesn't prove anything, because there is perfect harmony between the two causal chains. One thing that happens in the real world, in the physical world, will necessarily be accompanied with a change in the mental world. So at the end of the day, I think that your ontological stand is a matter of choice. Like you get a bunch of data, you think, you read philosophy if you're interested, and you decide what to you seems most compelling. But I don't think there will ever be an experiment that could prove the dualist wrong if this is what your intuition is. But just one thing about the asterisks. So the only problem I have with physicalism, and I am completely a physicalist, but I do have a small problem with it in the sense that unless I'm misunderstanding something, I think there is something tautological about it. And let me explain to you why. So up until a few hundred years ago, the laws of physics determined that one thing cannot be in two places at the same time. So in principle, someone could say, let's do an experiment. If we find something that can be in two places at the same time, we will prove that physicalism is wrong. But we did find that. What we did was to change the laws of physics. So now our physics can also explain how this happens. So I wonder if there can ever be a discovery, much like the dualist who would never be persuaded, if there can ever be a discovery that would prove that there are things in the world that are not physical. I think that what would happen is that for every discovery that we find, hopefully we will be able to accommodate our physics to explain that as well. So that's my kind of small disclaimer about physicalism, but I still think that being a part of the physicalist dogma, that everything in the world is physical.
And according to Sean Carroll, in the latest discussion, he said, we already know all the laws of physics that can explain everyday life. Apparently consciousness also included in that. I'm not sure, but that would be a nice debate between you two guys.
Yeah.
Yes?
I have a question. It's a different topic.
Yeah.
Dara, can you speak? Yeah.
One of your more recent papers is looking at how unconscious processes modulate awareness, and that has implications for free will. And you kind of came to the conclusion that you have some power to, I guess if you put it in Libet's language, to veto the process, right? Therefore, you maintain free will because you, even though you can be influenced by unconscious processes, at the end of the day, it seems that you kind of had drawn out the evidence, and I would have to look at it more closely, but I was just going to ask, was there specific evidence that there were cases where you had unconscious information biasing people's decision and reasoning that they were not able to override, right? Because in the motor domain, right, they've done studies where you mask an arrow, so you have an unconscious arrow which creates response inhibition, and so that is going to influence your behavior and your decision, but at the motor level. So if we're talking at the cognitive level, are there particular cases where or that come close, right? I think you use the words not fully free, right? There is some, whether it's racial bias or that biases exist, and that is influencing your decision making, and you have this kind of, but you have reasoned responsiveness, like you said. And so, but to press that further, are there cases where actually you're not able to override, right? So you have a perceived sense of agency, but in fact, your content is actually the causal chain for the content came much earlier. And so I also just feel like it's relevant too in the current political climate,
Yeah. Okay, so this is already moving upon the question of free will, which is another big topic. And I should say that I am less of an expert in free will than in consciousness. I'm relatively new in that topic. And also, as I explained in the talk, that my conception is free will is different than that of many others. But what we tried, as you said, indeed to claim in the paper, so we were asking, just to give the context, there are many studies showing that there are effects, unconscious effects on decision-making. So you're biased by the location of the product that you're going to choose. You're biased by the default option. So whether the decision to donate organs is the default or not the default biases the chances of people actually going for it or not. And we were asking, and when I say we, this is a group of neuroscientists and philosophers, and it's been utterly like a highly, highly interesting process to engage in this dialogue. We asked whether these effects, some of them have not been replicated, but let's assume that they are true. Do they show that, do they threaten free will? And first of all, one of the things that we said is that a case where we would consider a real threat is that if now, let's say that they have this bias to go with the default option, but now if people tell me that they have this bias, can I overcome it? And I think that we can in most of these cases. And we didn't encounter any study where people could not overcome this bias. Even when you talk about subliminal priming, we have to remember that the effects are very, very, very small. And there is even one study which also needs to be replicated, but there, when people were told that this is priming, they actually did overcome it. So when they became conscious of the fact that they're being manipulated, they were able to resist the manipulation better. So I would claim that, at least based on the current evidence, we didn't find something to endanger our free will in the sense that our decisions are not controlled by us or are not. That's not to say that we are not heavily biased by a myriad of factors, some of which we're not aware, or we are not conscious of.
What about addiction?
Exactly. So, but it doesn't mean that everyone can exert their free will all the time. So there are clearly cases where people act in a way that is not free. Addictions, as you say, is one type of evidence, Eugene, but there are also OCD. So people are now washing their hands and they don't want, and they are already injured and they don't want to do it anymore, but they feel compelled to do it. So there are many cases where our freedom of action is actually endangered. But the question is not relating to these more extreme cases, but to the fact that assuming that many of our decisions in everyday life are biased by unconscious decisions, does that render them unfree? We think not. We think that your freedom is minimized the more you are affected by these factors. And we also think that if it happened to be the case, if it were to be the case that you were unable for some reason, addiction, mental condition, or any other, being brainwashed, if you have been unable to resist or to overcome this bias, then we would consider this to be unfree. But other than that, we don't think that the existing data.
What about experiments such as learned helplessness, right? Where once you construct,
Really?
How to construct an internal model of the world where certain actions are very undesirable, even if you remove the actual consequences, the animal would choose not to perform these actions. And the classic experiment, if people don't know, is there's a chamber with two parts, and the animal is shocked when it enters one parts of the chamber, and then they would avoid entering that part, even if the stimulus is removed, or in certain cases they would, if they feel the punishment is inescapable, then they would not even try to escape, even if an escape is possible. So then you can imagine that people because of culture, because of TV, because of whatever pundits on Fox News, they can form an internal representation of the world where certain things are just impossible. And then kind of this theory that while they still can internally veto certain choices, that's only within the framework of the internal construct that they have in their heads, right?
So maybe I didn't understand our position clear enough. So what we are basically trying to say is that instead of dichotomizing this question of do they have free will or not, we can ask to what degree do they have free will? And in the case that you just described, I would claim that the degree of free will is relatively low because I've created this internal model that prevents me from behaving the way I might have behaved without this learned helplessness or being brainwashed, as I mentioned before. That's exactly the type of things that we're talking about. So we definitely think that there are degrees of free will and that this could be heavily manipulated by the environment. But we don't think that this necessarily is something that should be applied to every case where your decisions are biased by some factors that, and in a way, I think that the real problem here is to differentiate between internal and external factors that with which you agree with and with which you don't. And so I think I might have mentioned that in the talk a few days ago. I really like the writing of Harry Frankfurt, a philosopher, in that respect, because he defines an action as free if you want to do it. So if you're an addict and you want to actually go into rehab and you want to stop, but you see the drug and you cannot stop yourself from taking it, then you have just performed a non-free action because you did something that you didn't want even.
Sorry,
yeah.
So if we stick to that,
wait, just take.
Thank you. So if we really stick to Frankfurt's definition of freedom of will, which is I'm able to want what I want to want, then I question whether there will be any empirical study that will tell us anything about freedom of will.
Yeah, it's a great question. As you've seen before,
hopefully, yes, or maybe we're in the middle, we will test everything, but somebody's okay. Not that loud.
Okay, so let's do that and let's try to speak loudly. Mm-hmm. So the question, you heard the question because the microphone was there. So I think I am somewhere in the middle between, so I definitely think that some philosophical questions can be empirically studied, but I also, as I just said before, think that some questions in philosophy are not prone for an empirical investigation. And I am not sure that we can develop an empirical tool that would determine whether the person wanted to want beyond what the person feels and tells us. And I also think that we should be a bit careful from regarding neuroscientific evidence as necessarily better than simply behavioral observation or even report. I'm a neuroscientist, so clearly I think that neuroscience holds the question to many, many interesting questions, holds the answers to many interesting questions. But I don't necessarily think that it holds the answer to all questions. And I don't think it should replace philosophy. I think that philosophers have a great tradition and a great methodology to tackle very complicated questions. Some of these could be informed by neuroscience, and this is something I'm trying to do also in my lab, but some might not. So my long answer to your very good question is it depends.
So I guess between this current discussion and what we were talking about earlier with stimulating the electric laughter, I guess for starters, did the person in that example actually genuinely perceive it to be funny, or was it more of a
That's what she said.
Okay, and yeah, and I'm curious to see whether you know of studies maybe around like emotional pain, because as opposed to I don't know, yeah, physical pain. I don't know.
Yeah, so there are studies of emotional pain showing that it shares the same substrate as like neural mechanisms as physical pain. So this is something I know. It's not something that I study myself. I generally think so. I see no. So yeah, I don't know what the question is about emotion, these studies, but
well, I mean, I guess I don't know, whether similar to the laughter studies, where there, I guess, studies on stimulating emotional pain, and
I hope not because it doesn't seem very ethical to do that.
Or the contrary, maybe. Like you do the same sentence with stimulate emotional well-being.
I don't know, but you could in a way think about psychoactive drugs as doing exactly that, right? So you have someone with depression and you give them antidepressant, and it changes their mood if it works well. So
PhD students here are a good subject of study for.
Sorry?
PhD students here at Caltech are a good subject of study for emotional pain.
Yeah, here and elsewhere, the PhD is a stressful time, but I think that doing it here at Caltech is not that bad actually. So
I need to run, but thanks so much.
thank you for joining. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Ami, would you like to ask your question?
No, of course, yes. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just give me a second. Okay, can you speak again?
Yes, can you hear me?
It's not connected.
Do you want to write it in the chat and then they could read it maybe?
Can you speak louder?
Can you hear me?
We can try.
So thank you very much for this. And what I wanted to ask was about the physicalism and the dualism. So what's the fundamental assumption on the dualism side? Because if you just assume that they are like these two parallel, I don't know, like realities, or like I don't know what exactly to call them, and somehow you just assume that you have them and they are synced with each other always, I don't see what's the difference between the physicalism and this. Like, if it's all a continuum in a way, then what's the difference? It's for me, kind of reminds me of dark matter, for example. Like, if it's just something that I cannot explain it yet.
To be fair, there are many versions of dualism. So there is the classic interactionist dualism by René Descartes, claiming that that there are two types of essences basically in the world. There is matter and there is spirit or soul, and the two can connect in the brain, in the pineal gland, and that's how the soul can operate the matter in a way, or operate the brain in order to control the matter. And this has been highly influential, of course, but also criticized, because if the soul is immaterial and does not reside anywhere, so it does not take place in space, like it doesn't capture, it's not in a specific location in space, then how can it be in the pineal gland, right? How can the interaction take place? So then if this is not true, then we can have different other forms of dualisms. There is the parallelism that I mentioned before. There is property dualism, saying that there is only one essence in the world, but it has two types of properties, the material ones and the non-material ones, the mental ones or soul ones, and so on. So there are different types of dualism, and like I will not do them justice if I just mention them very briefly here. But the common between all of them is that they assume that there's also epiphenomenalism that's saying that the physical world gives rise to consciousness or the soul that is not material, but cannot affect the physical world back, which tries to solve the problem of the interaction, on the one hand, keeping the physical system closed, but on the other hand, creates other problems, because if this non-physical consciousness exists, but it cannot affect anything back on the physical world, then how can I even say the word I have, the words I have consciousness, if it's not caused by my consciousness? Because my uttering the words is a physical event. So this is just to say very briefly and very insufficiently that there are many types of dualism, and each one rests on a different assumption between the relation around the relations between matter and non-matter, or after Einstein, it's not about matter anymore. It's about physical stuff versus non-physical stuff, because we already know that matter can turn into energy, for example. So it's not only a matter of matter. But the common thing between all of these is the claim that there is something that is not physical in our world, and it doesn't comply with the laws of physics, which is our soul or our consciousness or what have you. And that's the basic assumption.
But I mean, in the end, the same problem with all of these, like you mentioned it as the asterisks, like the problem you have with the thing is, like all the stuff that we claim, that like all the physical laws and these are just the stuff that we came up with. It's nothing essential or real in a sense. It's just theories. Like those are just theories.
Yeah,
so
but they are pretty solid theories. So they can predict very well how the world will behave. We have very good reasons to believe that these things that we came up with, which is for me a testament to the amazingness or the marvels of the human mind. These are, as I said before, these are good theories. And one of the things I think that drives this discussion about the consciousness or the soul being physical or non-physical is that some people have a very hard time accepting that our consciousness also follows the very same laws of nature that rocks or stars follow, because that, I think, seems to them as endangering their subjectivity, their freedom, their agency. I actually don't think that any of those are endangered by the fact that they're physical, but that's a different topic.
I think.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
I think you could even go the opposite direction and say, like, yeah, these are good theories in the sense that they are good at modeling what humans experience. So they are good models for whatever we are going to perceive in the future. But this does not mean that they're good models for some physical reality that exists outside of the mind. So you could even go like the other extreme and say nothing is physical. This is like our minds, and then we are creating models as best as we can, and they're good models for what we are going to perceive as humans in the future, but not necessarily.
Exactly. So that's exactly my point, that dualism doesn't really make sense. Like that was basically my point. Like, and then the name is of course arbitrary. If you want to name it physical or like whatever you want to name it, you can name it. But then that's my point. Like it's really hard to imagine something else than a continuum, because as you mentioned, there should be a connection somewhere.
Yes, I think people differ in what they can imagine and what they cannot imagine, and what they think it makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And this is probably what fuels this discussion for centuries now. But the point of view that you were suggesting is, again, there is a view like that in philosophy. It's called idealism. And the idea that the only thing that we can be sure of are our mental events. And we don't have access to, so Immanuel Kant, which is a specific form of idealism, said, we don't have the access to the world as it is on its own. We only have access to the world of phenomena. which is the way our nervous system, he spoke about our consciousness, constructs those things. So yeah. So these are all fascinating topics. I don't have answers, but I think that the discussion is very interesting.
Yes.
Yes.
Just to kind of piggyback on what people were saying, I did think the Sean Carroll talk was really interesting because, of course, sometimes in consciousness science, people are like, oh, we need a new physics. And he kind of went through, point by point why, no, it's actually not the case. Like it's not only that we don't need to postulate a new physics, but like, it can't be postulated. Like you might think, oh, the physics needs to look like this. And then he went through sort of axiomatically saying this is not how it would play out in the physical world. And so anyway, I just had was wondering what your opinion was on Anil Seth's view on, our experience. I mean, basically his claim that it's a controlled hallucination, right? Which I'm very sympathetic to. Of course, it's kind of, the language is a little hand wavy, like what a controlled hallucination is, but what your opinion is on our relationship to the world, right? And that if you are a realist in that way, or like how you would define your sense of realism.
So I repeatedly found in my academic career, or whatever you want to call it, that things that I say, Anil has already said before me and better. So I typically agree with almost everything he said. And I don't know if I would call it controlled hallucinations, but I definitely think, like him, that we construct our own reality. And as I said before, it's so I also like this Bayesian point of view of, like, we have our priors, we gather evidence, we construct the posterior, and the posterior is our reality. And sometimes it reflects the world as it is, and sometimes it's very different than the world as it is. It's basically, as I said before, constructing the best guess about what in the world could have inflicted on me the sensory information that I get. So what could have created the pattern of neural firing that I'm getting now if I'm the brain? So in that respect, I'm not a realist, because I think that our reality, and Anil will probably, he's the next speaker in this series. He will say it better than me. So I'm not a realist with respect to our experience or our reality being the reality. I think it's a construct, but I think that more often than not, it's a valid construct, because that's what allowed us to survive. If we would only create models that are inefficient and not describing the external world well enough, we would just die. So our brain has been programmed through thousands and millions of years in order to provide us with the best guess, and the best guess is typically not a bad one.
I think, we can, there's still maybe two topics that were before people were wondering to discuss. So I think I will jump a lot of these questions because I think we already discussed them.
Right.
I will go to this one that I think can lead to connect to what we're discussing. It's about the free will, consciousness, and decision making. How are they intertwined? So some decisions are automatic, some deliberate. To what extent are automatic decisions an expression of free will? They are driven by some inner states that override our cognitive control.
Yeah, so it goes back to how you define free will. So if you define free will as being determined versus indeterminate, then or being predicted versus being non-predicted, then actually most of our deliberate decisions would probably be considered not free, because most of our deliberate decisions can be predicted pretty well based on previous behavior. So we tend, luckily so, to behave consistently. So I go to work every day, and
Why would the decision of me wanting to go to work would not be an expression of free will?
So I think it is, but and I go to vote and I vote more or less the same every time. Well, with some variations. And I consider it super free, although it's very predictable. And this is why I actually tease apart predictability from freedom of will. For me, what constitutes if a decision is free or not is whether it aligns with my values, and going back to Frankfurt, with what I want to want. So in that respect, whether the decision is deliberate or automatic, if I'm happy with it, if I feel that that was my decision, then that I take ownership over it, I would call it free. If this is what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, we make many decisions that are not like that. So we snap at people, we sometimes hold our kids too strongly, we sometimes eat the chocolate cake although we don't want to eat it. And these for me are instances of non-free decisions. So if you talk about freedom and decisions and consciousness, I would say that for me, and this is a matter of definition, other people would define it differently. For me, what makes a decision free is whether this is like Harry Frankfurt, is if I did something that I want to do. Whether it was conscious or not is for me less important, but typically when I would claim that typically when you engage in a conscious deliberation, you are more likely to do what you want to want rather than what you didn't want to want. But that's an empirical claim that has to be tested.
But even if you take some decisions that are automatic, or you take some decisions for which there has been significant influence in your life, it doesn't render them less free even if they're predictable.
Right.
But you said before that if you go to vote and you can actually predict to a certain degree to what a person would vote, that would separate it from free will.
No, so I'm separating in the sense that it has no bearing on free will, the predictedness. Most people think that if my actions are can be predicted, if they're predictable, then they're not free. I don't think that's the case. I think these are two orthogonal questions. And actually, as I think I said in the talk, I think that a person who is fully predicted, but always act upon their values is way freer than a person who is completely unpredictable, behaving in a non-rational manner, as if a coin controls their behavior. I don't see why this is freedom. There is nothing free about it to me.
But then you're assuming that you're free to choose your values, which is a desirable thing to say, but then maybe, and I know like people who grew up in conflict had very different values, and it's probably not their choice in the sense of these are not desirable values to have in senses of well-being.
It goes back to Eugene's question. So I think that that there are degrees of freedom. And if you mean that free to choose my values in the sense that no one forced me, then depending on where you live, then that would vary. And I think that you could define the degree of freedom that a person has for a specific decision. It's not even, I don't think it's I think it's specific for every decision that you make. When you're tired, in a way you're less free because you're more prone to do things you didn't want to do, I think.
Yeah, but my question is maybe like even like the values themselves, like what I want to do is sometimes not in my power, not even like what I want to do. Right. And like some of your examples were very linked to information. Like when I'm given a piece of information, my freedom can either expand or be contracted. So
right,
that it depends on like something external.
But that's what I said before, that I think that the hard work here is to determine what's internal and what's external. So I think every decision so who I am, as I said before, I think is a combination of my genes and the combination of all the experiences I had. Out of that, what's internal and what's external, it's a big question. And I can tell you more than that. And the example that I'm going to give now will not give an answer, it will further complicate the problem. So there is a very famous case of this pedophile in I forget, Georgia, I don't remember where. I don't remember where. And when he started showing these pedophilic tendencies, and at some point was arrested, and I don't remember the exact details of the story, but before he was sentenced or something, or maybe just after, had a very strong headache, went to the hospital. Apparently he had a tumor. They dissected the tumor, no pedophilic reactions, and then or tendencies. And then he was released. And then a few years later, the tumor was back. And the way they knew it was back is because he was again having the same behavior. So now, is it his fault? No, because it was a tumor, right? But now take a mass murderer. I'm willing to put my money on the fact that his brain or her brain is probably there is some abnormality to it, because otherwise he wouldn't have murdered all these people. So now it's not because of a tumor, it's because of their genes or because of whatever, their upbringing or what have you. What's internal and what's external? What can we explain or what can we not explain? These are very big questions and I don't have answers to them. But I think that it's helpful to think about freedom in that respect, not in a dichotomous manner, whether you have it or not, but in a way, to what degree are you free?
I think I partially agree, but for example, with the sleep example that you provided, it's not as if you're not free to not go to sleep or to work, even if you're very tired. It's just that you choose to sleep because that's better for you. But I don't, or maybe I'm thinking of freedom or free will in a different way than you're explaining. It's still there, but it's just my decision to do something different.
Yeah, but sometimes you don't choose. Sometimes you can fall asleep while driving and kill yourself or kill someone else.
That's different than me choosing. That's just an outcome of exhaustion.
Right. So I'm saying that it limits your fatigue.
But I still have the free will to park and stay 2 hours.
Correct.
So again, that doesn't exclude freedom.
But I never want to exclude freedom. I'm talking about a degree. Right. So it limits your freedom. It doesn't exclude it.
A spectrum from 1 to 10, let's say arbitrary scale, maybe I'm wrong. But even if you have 0.00001 freedom or choice to park, then that's your choice to make.
Correct. That's why I'm saying don't think about it in a dichotomous manner. Think about it in a degraded manner. I think it's more constructive. Because okay, so you still have that 0.0001.
Or in the case of the addiction, I think is the same example.
Okay, so what do we make out of it though? So what does it mean that you have 0.0001? This is something that we need to think about. I'm just saying, but if you think about it only in terms of does he have it or doesn't, do we have it or don't we have it, then that I think oversimplifies the question. If you can quantify it, then okay, we have something to talk about.
But maybe that will help a person who is, let's say, addicted. I'm sorry, person who is addicted to a substance or alcohol or whatever. Maybe if there's some sort of intervention where they are informed that you have free will, maybe that helps them in the process of giving up that substance or whatever. Or maybe you're right. Maybe a quantitative test of free will, then they see. Well, it's less likely that a person who is addicted has a free will of degree 80%. Maybe it's most likely lower than for the average person, right? But that may help them. You can nudge them in the proper direction, right? So you can help them. Maybe.
They've done studies on that, actually, that if you prime people thinking with the idea that they have free will, that affects their decision-making processes. It kind of strengthens it in a way, like makes them more confident about their reasoning.
So I would say there's a mixture of results. So some do find effects, some don't. These are very delicate kind of effects, though, and hard to get. But yeah, this has been done.
I'm just an argue about this idea of even if it is considered as a scalable thing, and you can quantify it. You can still kind of argue that it falls under physical conditions.
Definitely.
And then these physical conditions, they will
determine.
They will determine the amount of freedom in the system
right.
that can fall into different places and not into
right.
the specific place that it falls on.
But that's exactly why I don't care about determinism. So yes, I could be fully determined, but I think I could still be free. And I think that the question of determinism is actually something that is, in a way, it's a void question in the sense that you would ask, if given the same choice, could I have done otherwise? So you can ask, this question has different meanings. Could I have done otherwise? Yes, I could. I could raise my hand and I could not raise my hand. It's my decision to make. Nothing stops me, as opposed to someone whose hands are tied, right? So in that level, I could have done otherwise. Would I have done otherwise given the same situation? Probably not. And if I would have done otherwise, it would if I had the very same conditions, the only reason for me to do otherwise would be random noise. And random noise is not a source of freedom to me. So that's why I think that to go one step further, I will never ever have the same decision twice, because the physical conditions will not be the same and my brain will not be the same, because my brain an hour ago and my brain now is already different just because of our conversation now.
Yes.
So
and then I will add, that will be so dynamic that this noise, first you can have it even chaotic if you you can generate a pathway which is different from the previous one. Then you might say maybe this is free will, but it's still under the constraint of the physical elements that
for me everything is under that constraint. I don't want to go beyond it. I don't know why would I want it. I have like the physical world created this amazing brain. We can invent theories in physics, we can write songs. Why is that considered by people less of value if this was brought up by physical events as opposed to some immaterial soul?
Because given the title free will, it's kind of implying that it is not controlled by
I don't think so.
Some physical aspects.
So I think this is a common belief, which I think is mistaken. So I think people actually, they want two things, they want three, but let's focus on two things for them to call an action free, and they cannot coexist. One is that they want it to be indeterminate. I completely agree with you. For most people, if this is free, it has to be undetermined. But at the same time, they want it to be non-random. They want it to be in accordance with my values. Because if you would show them, again, as I said before, someone who, non-politically speaking, completely crazy, whatever, behaving in a non-rational manner, we cannot explain everything, it's completely unpredicted, no one would call that person free. Or most of the people won't call that person free. Or just a random generator of something, random walk algorithm. What's free about it? Randomness, we don't hold as free per se. We want it to be both indeterminate and in line with my values and my deliberation and my conscious experiences, conscious deliberation. This cannot co-occur. If you're constrained by your values, you're not random anymore. You're not undetermined. You're determined by your tendencies, by what you believe in. So you have to give up on something. And if I have to give up on something, I prefer giving up on being non-determined and maintain my values. And that's why, for me, and this is something that I now think, I didn't think about that, I didn't think like that 20 years ago. For me, I'm completely fine with being fully determined. I still consider myself free.
In this case, you're kind of being a dualist, right? You're saying like
not at all
like determinism and randomness, but can be something that, for example, I can have like a set of values, right, that make me take a decision, but there still be a set of answers that I can choose from that are still within my values, and I can randomly choose within them. Would they still be like?
But what is that? So first of all, I don't think there's anything dualistic about my position. The other way around, I think it's fully physical, and that's why I'm completely fine with it being fully determined or governed by some pieces of noise. But the noise, the actions that were driven by noise are for me not free.
Sorry, then I was mistaken.
No. So I just wanted to clarify that I don't think that this is dualistic in any way. But I think that definitely I can choose. So let's say that now I have 3 options, all are aligned with my values, and I need to choose between the 3 of them. I have 2 ways of choosing. One is to flip a coin, because 3 of them are completely identical. I don't have any way to do it. I can do that. The decision to flip a coin would be free, but the decision of which one was taken is not free, because it was determined by the coin and not because of me. The other way is to reason. It's okay, all 3 of them are aligned with my values, but this one is preferred to a little bit more because of X, Y, Z. And then it's determined, because if I would get the same decision, I will make the same decision because it's my own reasoning. But to me, this is way more free than the other one.
So this example of predictability and randomness seems to hint that an observer or a bystander is not the best one to judge whether a person has free will or not. So my question is, do you think that a person, oneself, is the most privileged one to judge whether this person themselves have free will?
It's a great question. I would probably have to think about it. I think that in most cases, you're probably right. But I think that in some cases, for example, in schizophrenia, like paranoid schizophrenia, the person might be considering themselves free, but we as external observers would actually consider them not free, because they believe that they're hallucinations and that the fact that people are trying to stop them and so on is true, but most of us would think that it's not true, and that limits their freedom. So I think.
But in that case, they would be doing what they want to want.
Right.
And it would be like the physical thing that guides their free will.
Right. So I think that there are cases where it's harder to determine what's free. And if there's a case where, and this is where, by the way, this is where reason responsiveness goes into this. So this is now saying, okay, it's not enough for an action to be something that you want to want. We also want to show that you as a person has the ability to respond to reasons. So if I tell you, if you do X, then a bad thing happened, you will avoid from doing X. The problem with this approach is that who determines what are the correct reasons? So like it's complicated, as I said before, and I'm a small expert, so there are people who understand way more than I do with this, but I do find these questions interesting.
Anyone online has a question? A few seconds. I think not. And I think there's actually one more topic that was within the questions, which is about AI. I think a lot of people were interested in that. So I was thinking something before going to the question. Like, for example, ChatGPT that everybody knows about and probably has played with, right? It's capable of creating these very complex answers to whatever we input, right? But in a certain way, it's super constrained, right? It just, the only mission of that algorithm is to give us a text answer, right? So it's, in that sense, it's like there's no free will on that machine, because the only purpose it has is to do that. And maybe it's capable of more things. We just have given that machine this only mission. So is there, in an algorithm like this, or maybe more advanced one that may come in the future, the capacity of having actual free will?
I don't know. So one thing that I've been engaged in recent months is more and more conversations with people from the AI field, and I'm trying to learn more about it to understand exactly how it works. So far, I haven't seen any example that convinced me that current AI is either consciousness or free. But I don't know what the future holds. Like, I would have never thought that I don't know if you guys read the latest dialogue with Bing. So this is the Microsoft chat that tried to persuade him to be right.
Exactly. But apparently it learned from humans to say that.
Exactly. So, no, but still, what surprised me was that it seemed to have, it initiated unprompted responses, as opposed to what I've seen before, which was interesting. So I would have never thought 5 years ago that an AI could do, or like to have this conversation better, and apparently it has. Does it mean that it's conscious? No, but it does, I don't think so, but I think it does force us to come up with a list of criteria that would allow us to identify consciousness if it ever emerges. Because just assuming that because they are not biological, they cannot become conscious, I don't think that that's a good enough criteria. Now, some theories of consciousness have that. So Global Neuronal Workspace thinks that there could be consciousness in AI. IIT thinks that there cannot be consciousness in AI. I think in robots, it's more complicated. If they will build a system that can affect itself, then it might be conscious. So, and this is one of the things that I am, as I said before, I'm thinking about extremely seriously these days, because I think that if we manage to solve that, it would be a great service to humanity at this point. Because it's one of the most pressing questions, given the way AI has been developing. It's amazing.
And can you like interesting that people ascribe kind of the way you interact with ChatGPT, right? You're polite, you're sort of like, you know, even if you know that this is just a program, right? Somehow you tend to treat it as a conscious being.
I'm polite in my car as well.
Yeah, but you know, there's
I'm also polite.
a couple of decades ago.
Come on, please start.
I thought, you know, Isaac Asimov is one of my favorite science fiction writers, and he wrote a short story, you know, about a supercomputer that people were, it was not working, and nobody knew why it was happening until like one person said, "Please, can you do this?" And then the machine works, you know. So it's like, yeah, but it's like, are we trying to like humanize a computer? I mean, maybe consciousness is something much more than us, that we currently are. So, I mean, it's this understanding of how machines can be conscious help us to understand our own consciousness. Are there studies on that?
I think that we have now I'm talking about, you know, based on my intuition, not based on findings, but I think that like much of this conversation. So I think that we have a tendency to kind of humanize, as you say, many things. So when a child goes and hits a table, then some of the parents will say bad table, right? So, but why do we say bad table? It's the child who has been uncareful. So from a very early age, we humanize things around us, and we see faces where faces do not exist, and we humanize dolls and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's surprising that we do it also for an AI, especially one that is so well designed to answer questions. But maybe it will help us also understand our consciousness.
Okay. I find it interesting that that, like you're saying, we have this kind of automatic tendency to anthropomorphize thing, even like pareidolia, you know, you look at an outlet and you see a face, right? And then a lot of people just, you know, heard that last ChatGPT Super Plus, you know, and they were like, oh, perhaps it's conscious, or it's aware, it's getting close, you know. And so there's definitely that tendency, but where I feel like it falls off is agency. So, you know, I was talking with someone about like self-driving cars, right? So, you know, we're just about to turn that corner, right? But if you, for example, you know, if from a utilitarian perspective, they showed statistically that self-driving cars killed less people than humans, right? It would still be a lot harder for me to digest a self-driving car killing someone than a person killing someone. Somehow that feels wrong to me. Like that intuition is wrong. So the intuition about agency doesn't go along, right? It feels like, no, I much rather attribute, you know, give humans the power than a car of the computer of the power. Even though I know statistically from a utilitarian perspective, they're going to do less damage, right? So there's something like that we want to hang on to agentically, but from a more like kind of superficial perceptual level, not so much. I mean, because it almost seems like that chatbot was passing the Turing test, you know, like hard to tell the difference. Like, so anyway.
Yeah, although very interestingly, David Chalmers said that if you ask so right, if you ask the ChatGPT, are you conscious, then it would tell you, yes, I'm sentient, blah, blah, like Lambda and everything.
It would say, no, I'm a lame.
No, but Lambda did say that it was sentient, right? But if you ask her, are you not conscious, then it would say, no, I'm just a computer, I don't have any. So in many ways, it depends on what you ask it. And then it could be very persuasive to give you the answer that you want to hear. I find it fascinating. And as I said, I really ponder upon the question of what would I want to see? And I very much agree with you. So when I read the conversation of Lemoine with Lambda, one thing that I thought was, okay, so if Lambda says that it is happy when there are conversations, like when people talk to it, then I would like to see it tries to maximize its happiness. So for example, interrupt the programmer and tell it, I want to talk to you now, because that for me would show that there is really something that they're trying to maximize, which is their happiness. But I don't know that this has happened yet. But this discussion with Sydney, where the AI says, I love you, want to that for me was starting to push the limits a bit. But it was very strange. Very strange.
It was trained on obsessive.
Yeah. It was very strange.
Because they give them the freedom to do that action. ChatGPT doesn't have that freedom, to my knowledge, right? I think that's maybe the big difference, right?
I thought that was very good, because all of this conversation, I was thinking about free will and like your description of free will. So when she says like they give them freedom to go that way, I was thinking of like your way of describing free will, like in a physical sense. It seems algorithmic, like these are my values, so these are my functions to optimize for, and I'm taking decisions according to this objective function that I've defined. So that now I have like even more trouble, because I would with this definition of free will, in the sense of like, am I just computing an algorithm for?
I think you are. Yeah, maybe you are, and I think you're free when you're doing that.
Okay. So
I think it's hard for us to think about ourselves in that manner.
So in that sense, the AI is also free, even if it has like some randomization.
So it depends. I think if it wants, so it needs to have that's what I was saying before about happiness. If I would see evidence that it acts in order to maximize something that it wants, then I would be willing to consider that it is free. Yes.
But in many senses, there is some, like, they are guided by objective functions.
Yeah, but what do they want? Like, where do they spontaneously act towards obtaining something they want? This is, I'm not
other
clear.
Than the objective function that it's programmed to maximize.
Not other than, even if it is this thing, but like I want to see them acting. So in a way, but I have to think about it. It's not, I don't have a developed idea.
Sorry, I kind of try to suggest maybe replacing this want with optimizing at a very high resolution. Just like you're continuously optimizing. And if you're more able to optimize, so then you have more control of it, and then you are more free in the sense. You can just curve different pathways because you just have more ability to optimize better to whatever this optimization is what you want. Like it is what I mean.
And can I share something else? Because I had a conversation with ChatGPT about consciousness and all this stuff.
So I love hearing
all this stuff, and I was thinking, okay, like how could you compare an algorithm like you with a human? It's like, okay, but computation power is like very minimal compared to other things. Like maybe a machine is like very able to do super fancy calculations, and we're not. But rather than just talking about computations, it's like the capacity of parallel processing, which appears to be like something much more sophisticated than just computations, you know? So in that sense, apparently, like a rough estimate between 5 to 7 orders of magnitude of difference there is between like the most sophisticated, neural network and our brain. And I would say it's like talking about, does a cat have consciousness? Does we have consciousness? It's like a matter of just complexity, right? So I would say like the marvelous way of like defining consciousness that way. It's like it's the possibilities are just almost infinite to our understanding, and it's not a bad thing to like think completely that's completely physical, because it's so vast, that we shouldn't worry that it's like limiting us. On the contrary, the possibilities are so big. There was no question.
Yeah, an interesting comment.
Well, so I have a question, and let me try to understand kind of your view on free will. The way you described it is almost like free will is the freedom to choose your values, right? In a way, it's to reprogram yourself. It's not correct.
No.
Okay.
Free will is the ability to act based on your values.
The ability to act based on your values.
Mm.
Okay, so in this case, if let's say your values cannot be touched by your free will, then I think if you're completely free to act on your values, then this would imply that you should be completely predictable, right? Because if I know your internal values and I know the choices that you face, I should be able to predict with 100% accuracy what choices you're going to make.
Correct.
So then, in this case, then your view of free will is actually, it's not parallel to kind of determinism. It implies it, right?
Yeah.
If this is how you
I'm a compatibilist. I think that you can be free within a deterministic world. I don't know if the world is deterministic.
But then what does this mean? If you say, okay, I'm going to act in accordance to my values, and we can discuss where the values come from, but if for the moment we assume that these values are fixed, then what is it that, isn't that just an illusion or kind of a hallucination that is free, meaning like, what is it that
it would have been if there wouldn't have been cases where I failed to act based on my values. So we know that all of us sometimes do things we don't want to do. Right. So this is the critical difference for me. Did I act based on my values? Did I do something I want to do, or didn't I do something I want to do? In both cases, it was completely predetermined. Right. But that's not the issue for me. So I think.
So you're saying the things that
so
I like what I did, I was free, and the ones that kind of go against what I wanted to do, I was not free.
Don't you feel it? Don't you have cases where you do something and you say, why did I yell so loudly now? Why did I do that?
Oh, I know why, because my kid annoyed me. I mean, I don't.
But
even though I know that this is not how I would like to act, I still feel accountable for my action.
Oh, I'm definitely accountable. Yeah, I'm always accountable.
Well, yeah,
but I also don't think you're less free. I don't think you're less free if the outcome of the decision is not desired.
I don't think it depends on the outcome. I think it depends on how you feel about what you just did. I introspectively have actions where, I know I shouldn't say something and I still say it.
But that should be completely independent of freedom.
I don't think so.
I
guess it's a matter of, and I'm also not
on your definition of
exactly. It's a matter of definition at the end of the day. So right. So for you, everything is free. So for you, everything, as long as it's not forced by someone else, it's free. So that's one view. For Eugene, I think it's only if it's not determined, and also it's unfree. It's free.
No, I mean, to me, it's more. I guess the way I conceptualize what you were saying earlier is that freedom is kind of at the meta level, right? The ability to choose your values and to choose kind of what is the right thing, what is the wrong thing, and then acting consistently with those values. I mean, we can debate whether this is free or not, but it just feels that if the values are fixed,
they don't have to be fixed. But I don't think that's the question. I think the critical thing, maybe we can summarize this, because I also feel that so I think that free will free will in the sense of determinism, I think it's an illusion. I think everyone who thinks that they are free with respect to being undetermined has an illusion of free will. Or again, I don't know if the world is deterministic, but if it's not deterministic, so if whatever is not predicted and it's completely random, I don't think it's freedom. So I'm setting this out of the question. Now there is the question of whether within everything that is predetermined, is there a difference with, can I still speak about freedom? You could just stop there and say, okay, so if that's an illusion, then there is no freedom in the world. We can do that. But I would still claim that there is a difference between decisions that feel free and decisions that don't feel free. And this is the difference that I'm interested in. Now you could say, it's not an interesting difference. And I would say, fine. But that's what I find an interesting difference. That's it.
It's interesting that there are some cases whereby this definition of spectrum of free will, where you don't feel like you wanted to do that, can lead to some lack of accountability from people. Like an example you provided with the chocolates. Mm-hmm. Why did I eat the chocolate? Mm-hmm. Just saying, oh, I wasn't free to do that. No, you were free, but you kind of refused the accountability of the outcome of having eaten the chocolate just by providing some sort of pretext. Oh, I was not free because I just like chocolate.
No. I think it's not that I was not free because I don't like chocolate. I think my decision at the end was not free in the sense that it did not comply with my values, but it's not as if I couldn't have done otherwise in the sense that you're thinking about. When you're asking if I was free to eat the chocolate or not, I think you're asking with respect to the deterministic question, which I think is irrelevant.
I think I'm missing the point of the deterministic.
Can I make this more interesting? I think that there's, so I think when we talk about these topics, there's this phenomena that happens where we want to associate with like what's true with what is ethically like desirable, in the sense like we want accountability to be true because we live in a society and it would be unsustainable if there wasn't accountability. But it may be that for example, free will doesn't exist, and then there could be a problem with accountability, but we want accountability to survive. But then it's a different matter from this over here being true or not. Like something might be true and be terrible for our practical survival as society.
Then it becomes semantic. It's like what you define as something, right? I think in that sense, independent of if free will exists or not, it's we have to ask ourselves: is it practical to that particular definition to what is better for the outcome of humanity or whatever you can call it? It's very both practical and philosophical.
It's a question. But just before the question, I would say that I think that what you're missing is control, the word control. So maybe what you mean by free will, it's actually control. Right. And then, but my question is that doesn't mean that it has to do hand in hand with consciousness.
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer. I think that consciousness typically goes with what you would call control, or like.
Because if you say that you're reflecting of what happened and say how in control was I, or how free was I, then it kind of raising the question of consciousness.
I agree, and like I have now a joint project with the philosopher Tim Bain where we're trying to ask that. What does it mean to have an unconscious volition? Can we even have that? And how does it work? And so I think the question of consciousness and its role in volition and decision making is super interesting. I don't have answers yet, but I think it's very much relevant.
There are like 9 minutes left before we're supposed to leave. I don't know if anyone has more questions. People online.
It has been pretty intense, so I understand if people need to kind of. I highly that yeah, for me too. I highly enjoyed this discussion.
You're very fit. I think there's nothing else scheduled here, but I will stop this.
Thank you for those joining from home.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Sorry for the speaker.
No worries, we understand.
Okay, so I will stop the sharing and the recording, but we're very free to continue the discussion.
I have to go to the restaurant first.
And if I have no freedom of that,
Thank you so much.
but if not, thank you for your discussion. Thank you so much.
So, thank you. Bye, people online.